My name is Kevin Ferrie. I work for the Office of Boating Safety for the U.S. Coast Guard, and I'm in the product assurance branch. What that means is, our overall program goals are to promote safe boating through product assurance and product interface. So we look at the technical aspects of the vessel itself and ensure that they're safe and compliant with federal regulations and following best voluntary practices through standards such as the American Boat and Yacht Council. Um, the way that our office does the product assurance, it's really three facets. One of them is reviewing the products or the boats in the factories and facilities where they're manufactured. We're not going to talk about, or I'm not going to talk about that today. The other is reviewing accident statistics and accidents, which I believe Brian Goodwin talked about. And the third is listening to the consumer. And that's what I want to touch base on. If you're a consumer, if you own a vessel, if you're running a vessel, if you're a guest on a vessel and something is wrong, how can that information get back to the Coast Guard in a way so that we can collate it and look for accident or trends, not accident trends, but trends in consumer complaints and consumer observations of the vessels. And we actually, on our website, the uscgboating.org, there's a consumer safety defect report that anyone can fill out. And when that happens, that comes to our office and we review them. And while your voice may only be one person, we're looking for trends and statistics as they come in. So it's important that we get as many consumer safety related input as possible for us to be able to analyze trends and see if there are problems. What do we look at when we evaluate a consumer defect? We look a lot of the same things we look at when we look at recalls. And a recall, if there's a safety issue on a vessel, we may require the manufacturer or the manufacturer may voluntarily recall the vessel to repair it. And there's really a couple of different um, situations and where a vessel may be recalled. One is regulatory noncompliance. If the vessel just doesn't meet the federal regulations and that regulation is safety related, we may recall the vessel. So if you, the consumer, gave us a report and it was clear that this vessel was not compliant with regulations, we may go back to the manufacturer and ask them to correct that. The second and a little more gray area is if there's a substantial risk of safety defect, i.e., does this situation that is brought to our attention, while maybe not directly impacted by regulations, or it's like, compliant with the regulations, or it's not regulated, an area of the vessel that's just not regulated. But if it presents a risk to safety, you know, is it worth correcting that risk? And to do that, we typically evaluate it based on a few key criteria. One is the hazardous situation must occur without warning, virtually without warning. So an obvious wear and tear item or a maintenance item doesn't meet that criteria. The second, it has to occur with some frequency. And that's why your voice is so important as a consumer or a law enforcement agency or anyone in the industry that sees a lot of boating trends. The more information that we can collect, then we could start to see, oh, this is happening with frequency. We need to address that. And the third criterion is that it has to actually pose a risk to, death or serious industry. I'm sorry, death or serious injury. Um, and if those three things occur, then it's probably worth the Coast Guard's time to investigate the problem and determine if corrective action and measures need to be taken. So, we get these safety defect consumer reports frequently. And for instance, there was a case that I received last year, and a consumer just said this vessel is not compliant. There's a lot of things wrong. Um, the fuel filters are mounted directly above batteries, and the positive battery terminals aren't protected. And if the fuel spills, it could be, a hazard. So we actually traveled to the vessel and inspected the vessel and found that there were some um, problems with the vessel that, were not consistent with good marine practice. Um, the issue with this, when we looked at those criteria that I talked about, is it was an outboard power vessel. It was outboard power. It was over 30 foot long and multiple engine, offshore center console fishing boat. Um, and if you're aware of the federal regulations, fuel and electrical regulations only apply to inboard powered boats. So this was not a regulatory issue. And, if you're like I was when I started this job, I would think, well, why wouldn't they apply? Well, at the time when the regulations were written, outboard powered boats were tiller steered with a 5 gallon red gas can. It wasn't a 36-foot center console with 800 horsepower hanging off the back. So the industry has evolved way faster than our regulations have, and that's the primary reason. So there was obviously an issue in good marine practice and why the vessel was constructed in this way. So as the Coast Guard, we investigated that. We talked to both the boat owner and the manufacturer, um, and tried to come to some resolution of, okay, it's not regulatory. It was a one-off design, so it's not gonna, nothing's occurred, right? There was no accident. Um, but it just didn't make sense. And that's where these consumer safety defects really can help us identify some of these hazards and make the marine industry safer from a technical perspective. Another situation that we handled recently, it was an imported boat and it was an electric boat. And this boat is very popular over in Europe, but they aren't very popular here in the United States. And it was ordered directly from a European country, imported into the country and sold. And it complies with the EU standards, but there were some issues with it where it just didn't comply with our federal regulations just because the standards aren't consistent. And we received a report on that. And in that situation, um, we were able to link the boat owner who had the questions with the importer who brought the boat in with the European country that built the boat and discuss with all three parties on how do we make this boat compliant with the United States. Because even though it's imported into the US, any vessel that's offered for sale in the United States has to have a certification label on it that states that it complies with all applicable United States federal regulations, and this vessel did not. So that was another situation where not safety related necessarily like the first example that I talked about, but still a non-compliant vessel that had had issues that had to be corrected to be able to be sold in the United States. So the Consumer Safety Defect Report, which is on the uscgboating.org website under recalls and safety defects, if you pull that up, the first question is who's reporting it? And some of the options are passenger occupant, law enforcement officer, boating law administrator, owner, and other, where they could fill in. And why is this important? Well, I think most of us may be aware of the Boating Accident Reporting Database, or BARD, in which we collate all accidents. Um, and that's a very valuable tool that we use. And what we've learned from that tool is that the overwhelming majority of accidents actually are human factors driven, i.e., somebody made a mistake. Now, our division, the product assurance branch, does scrub that information to try and identify situations where it may have been a mechanical failure, or we can look at trends and go back to the boating manufacturing industry to improve safety. But if a law enforcement officer or a boating law administrator is entering something into BARD or doing an investigation and says, wow, this really is an unsafe boat or a piece of equipment that's dangerous, not only can you fill it out in the boating accident reporting database, you can go to this consumer safety defect report, click whether you're a law enforcement officer or a boating law administrator, and submit this. And then it goes directly to the product assurance branch, to my division, so we can see it and not have to wait for the BAR database to be finalized for the year to look at it and hopefully identify that it was a technical failure that caused the accident. So it can be a critical tool for anyone in the industry to use this reporting source to talk directly to the engineers at the product assurance branch.